Imagine you go into a medieval city for the first time. Maybe you're a peasant, you've spent most of your life living in a village. The sounds of the city, the scale of it, the busyness of it must have been amazing. You're going to have the metalworkers hammering away. You're going to have the cries of the pie sellers and the peas cod hucksters. You're going to have the smell of animals. You're going to have the smell of horse dung on the street and oxen dung. You're going to have the noise of wheels. You're going to have everybody crowded together in an incredibly complex and busy environment. If the wind's in the wrong direction, you're going to smell the tanneries as well and their stench. Everything is going to be very different. But there is one thing all of those people that work in a medieval city have in common. What is it? Busy working men and women were the lifeblood of the growing urban economy in medieval England. And by the 12th and 13th century, it's almost certain you would have been a member of a guild, a specific craft guild for the job you were doing. Those guilds provided a monopoly in that local area to the people that were part of it. Guilds were much more than just trade associations. They were the lifeblood of many aspects of medieval urban life. Historically, guilds form into two broad categories. You had the craft guilds, the people that made things out of raw materials, and you also had the mercantile guilds, basically the guilds of merchants that sold finished goods. Craft guilds came in all sorts of flavours. There were dyers, tinsmiths, blacksmiths, hatters, purse makers, girdlers, fishmongers, goldsmiths. Any trade you could think of was represented by a guild, and some of the guilds actually were very small parts of it. So if you were a blacksmith and you were making armour for somebody and that person wanted it gilded, well, you needed to give that armour to the goldsmiths guild to get the decoration put on it. There were some unusual guilds in the medieval period. Gong farmers, for example, those people who euphemistically took out the night soil, the human waste of a night. They took it away. Initially it was sold to farmers and spread on the land, so it had a certain value. They would also empty cesspits. They were the ones that were allowed to empty the cesspits. And we know that a lot of cesspits overflowing caused quite a lot of court cases, because we have records of a lot of court cases of dangerous cesspits. Occasionally the noxious fumes caused them to die as well, so it wasn't without risk. The gong farmers actually, strangely enough, became very wealthy as a guild, because in the later medieval period, the raw material for gunpowder was sourced from, amongst other things, human waste. Along with the gong farmers, there are some other unusual guilds. There were the girdlers, for example, who made all kinds of belts. There were also the scriveners. These were professional writers. Now, it's plausible that most people could write and read, at least partly, in the urban medieval environment. Maybe not the poorest people, but lots of people could read and write, but not necessarily very well, and not well enough to make presentable documents. So scriveners' tasks were often to dictate letters in a slightly formal way, to put things down for the courts, for example, and just to write nice letters in good handwriting to be sent to somebody else. Quite where the trope of adventurers guilds or thief guilds comes into it, beloved of fantasy novels. I don't think I've come across anything like that in the historical record. However, there is a fighters guild. There appears to be in a few Anglo-Saxon documents, I think called a frith guild or a knighten guild, which seems to be an organisation, a sort of brotherhood of fighting men. So that's plausible. The concept of the guild is not medieval. It goes back a lot earlier than that. We have records from ancient Rome of things called collegia, which are associations, trade associations. They seem to have died out post-Roman in what used to be known as the Dark Ages or the early medieval period. We don't really hear much about trade guilds as such, or towns and cities, possibly because there wasn't much trade. But they really come into their own later on, and they still exist, of course. Guilds are still a thing today. So what did guilds actually do? Well, they managed and regulated a specific trade in a specific area. They were a legal monopoly with all the good and bad things that could be associated with that. Typically, guilds organised the trade. They controlled prices. Controlled prices were a big thing in the medieval period. Inflation was simply controlled by not allowing prices to go up, apart from in very specific circumstances. For example, beer brewing was a set price unless the raw material barley prices had gone up. And then they could put the prices up a little bit. But broadly speaking, you knew what you had to pay for a certain thing in a certain way. Theoretically, they controlled the quality as well. And they had an organisation which restricted foreigners, and by foreigner I mean somebody not from the local area, so not from another country, but from the local area. They restricted foreigners doing trade that was competitive as well. In some cases banning it outright, or in other cases charging an extra tax on those foreigners doing business in the local area. It's a good thing or a bad thing depending on your perspective. There wasn't really a free market in the same way, and guilds prevented that very much. They controlled the market in certain goods and services. Guilds played a very significant role in society in medieval towns and cities. They provided welfare for members that had fallen on hard times. They also generated social events, and the senior guild members actually became amongst the top non-noble members of society. The Council of Guild members was incredibly powerful and negotiated directly with the top nobles or even with the king. Nobody could cross the guilds and get away with it. Guilds contributed to the broad social life of a town or city. They put on festivals, they provided events. They often rented their rooms out to the local people for events, and they seemed to take their civic responsibilities very seriously indeed. Medieval guilds were very hierarchically structured, as you can imagine. Most things in the medieval period were. They were usually run by a group of senior, experienced craftspeople, usually men, called wardens in some cases. They had lots of different names. Their job was to manage the guild, but also manage the quality of the output of the guild members. They were there to ensure that the guild's good name was maintained amongst the general population. They were also there to adjudicate disputes between guild members, to supervise the training of new people that were entering into the guild, and to have a role in the social life of the town or city, and to negotiate with the noble powers of the day. Not all guilds were incredibly powerful. Some were very small and very minor, although they were probably important locally. But some guilds, especially the mercantile guilds, became as powerful as city-states. They became nations in their own right and had armies. And they dealt with kings and emperors as equals. The first rung of guild membership was the apprentice. These were usually boys or young men, certainly somebody in their early teens who was apprenticed to a master in their workshop. They didn't get paid. They did get food and lodging though, which is not to be underestimated in the medieval period. I mean, being housed and being fed were crucially important. The guild master's job was to teach the apprentice the skills of the job. These tasks often were very menial to begin with. Part of the job, probably for an early apprentice, was just to watch what was going on and probably sweep up at the end of the day. They were occasionally treated badly, although there were standards for treatment and types of food they had to eat, for example. But I'm sure there were abuses that went on. But broadly speaking, it was considered to be very lucky to be apprenticed to a guild master, whatever that guild would be. Maybe gong farmers were not so popular, but maybe they were. They were wealthy and powerful, and that was meaningful in the medieval period. Apprenticeships typically were for a set period of time, so 5 to 7, sometimes 9 years. That's what you would expect to spend as an unpaid intern, if you like, an unpaid apprentice learning the craft. You would likely do more and more things as you went on. So as you'd spent a couple of years watching, you might do some of the very basic tasks. Once you finished your apprenticeship, you became what's called a journeyman, a man who could charge for the day's work. Journey as in journeying as well, because some journeymen actually travelled and sold their master's goods. They would literally have pattern books. Armourers, for example, would have pattern books. They would go to the castles of the rich nobility and say, would you like a new suit of armour? Here's what my master can build. They would then take the order, go back, and the master and the apprentices and the other journeymen would make it, and it would then be delivered. So journeymen did journey, but that's not the direct derivation of the title. The title comes from journée, as in day, which means they could now charge for their work each day. They could also work for different masters as well. So you had certain skills, but you were not a master. To become a master, you needed to be qualified. You need to do a masterwork, a masterpiece. That's where the term comes from. A very good piece of work which was judged by the other masters of the guild. And if it was found, presumably the politics took a role here, but if it was found that the masterpiece was good enough, you would potentially be voted in as a fellow master. And then you could have your own studio, have your own apprentices and journeymen, and you would have a seat on the guild council, possibly. Although not all masters were wardens, so perhaps there's another hierarchy to go up to. You have to become a very well-known master to become on the guild, on the board of the members of the guild. Older apprentices seem to have become quite frustrated. Not every apprentice could become a journeyman, and some seem to have behaved badly enough that their apprenticeship was extended. One of the punishments for bawdy behaviour, drunkenness, or excessive fighting was to have your apprenticeship lengthened, which meant you had no free money. I don't quite know where they got the money for their drinking or their bawdiness from, unless they had side jobs perhaps, but basically, apprentices were not supposed to have their own money. It was when you became a journeyman that you started to earn your own living. But it appears that apprentices became sometimes quite frustrated. And we have a lot of records of apprentices of different guilds fighting each other. In 1327, the apprentices of the saddle makers and the apprentices of the bit makers, two very similar trades you might think, they came to physical blow on the streets of Cheapside and Cripplegate in London. In 1339, fishmongers were involved in major street battles with goldsmiths. In 1517, frustrated apprentices seem to have attacked wealthy merchants, foreigners and bankers, and many were hanged for their crimes. Guilds usually operated under a set of written down rules, and we have some of these. They still exist, and they are wonderful pieces of work. The Hatters Guild of London in 1347 wrote down specifically that 6 of the most honourable and trusted hat makers of the town were to be called wardens and to guide the guild. We also know why they wanted to set up a guild, and I'm going to read this out because the language is absolutely wonderful. What they said was, some workmen in the trade have made hats that are not high quality, and this deceives the common people and brings great scandal, shame and loss to the good folks of the hatter's trade. Therefore, no workman in the trade shall do any work by night, but only in clear daylight, when the wardens may openly inspect their work. These are trade standards that are really interesting. They also go on to talk about the punishment, and they say, anyone who does otherwise shall pay a fine to the council chamber for the first and second offence, and the third time shall lose his freedom. Now, losing your freedom wasn't actually going to jail. There weren't that kind of things in the medieval period. It's far too expensive to keep somebody in prison. They were lockups, usually for drunkards, so you'd be just chucked in there, the door would be locked, you'd be let out the next morning with a massive hangover. But what they meant by losing your freedom was that they would say that you were no longer a free man of the town. Now, all guild members had to be freemen of the town they were in. And if you lost the freedom of the town, it meant that you could not be a guild member, and it meant that you could be thrown out of the guild, and you would not be allowed to pursue your job in that local area. That was a disaster. You would be lacking any kind of economic status whatsoever, and maybe you would have to leave and go somewhere else. Maybe the rumours would follow you and you couldn't become a hatter elsewhere. What actually happened to hatters that were flung out of the Hatters Guild? We just don't know. There are no records of it. But maybe they wandered to another place and made bad hats in another town and got thrown out again. Or maybe they just became wandering vagabonds or wild hat makers working in the wilderness, making bad hats for traveling adventurers. I don't know, but it's interesting they had those specific rules. They were very much trying to maintain the reputation of the guild members. Merchant guilds were associations of traders dealing with the sale of goods. Some of the sale of goods was across national boundaries, so they would be involved in international shipping. They also created things like share ownership. They created things like insurance and banking and promissory notes. So the mercantile guilds really underpin much of the modern day capitalist structure that exists today. An awful lot of it can be traced back to the inventions of the mercantile guilds, particularly in Italy in the late medieval period. Many guilds have of course gone away in the modern day, but some are continuous, and to this day there are guild members in major places, particularly in London. There are a lot of guild members in London. There's well over 100 official guilds. They're called livery companies today. They don't have monopolies over certain trades, but they are influential, and in some cases they do control a lot more than you might imagine. Some modern guilds obviously are new inventions. You can argue that in fact the goldsmiths turned into bankers.